We are working through St. Anselm. I'm at my kitchen table trying to do this before the rest of the family is up and mobile and interrupting. I think because of a variety of different reasons, this is like attempt number 8 to make this video actually work. Some of it was me, some of it was interruptions from family, some of it has been the oh so marvelous joys of technology where QuickTime just decides to poop out and stop working. So, listen, we're capping off on Anselm with this video. You then will need to continue working on your confessions work. It's due Friday, okay? Next video session after this one, we're going to start St. Thomas Aquinas, okay? So we're going to back up a little bit on Anselm, work our way through toward where we are now, and then I'll cap off what Anselm has to say, and we'll go from there. Hopefully, the video will actually get us through to the end. Prayerfully, the video will get us through to the end. And then we can kind of we can work from there. Sorry, my train of thought isn't fully awake yet. I need more of this. Coffee is good. So, let's do this. Guys, while we have this really interesting situation on our hands with being pretty isolated in our homes, okay? While we have this situation and we're pretty isolated, let's remember connect in ways that we can, text message, right, phone calls with family members that are disconnected from us. Let's connect via FaceTime chats and online whatevers and video messaging and all of these different ways that we can be present with people because we need to be connected to people. And this is something Anselm's going to hit on today. We're made to be in relationship, and when our relationships get wonky or dysfunctional, or they look weird, or we pull ourselves away and we isolate, we aren't exactly what we were intended to be, and that has ramifications for us on our health and our felt emotional need and all the rest of that. And so here's my encouragement to you in the coming days as we do this electronic stuff. Find ways to connect, okay? Social distancing doesn't necessarily mean we got to live like hermits and never talk to each other again. So we're going to have to ride this out together to some extent of it, okay? Now, all that said, let's get to 2 really critical points. Number 1, pray, right? We need to be people of prayer, and we need to be people who are studying the scriptures. And so have that time for yourself. 2, be smart, right? Be cautious. Don't be an alarmist and go clear Kroger and Costco out of toilet paper. Other people need supplies, people, right? But be smart, right? Be cautious about where you go and when and how you get there and that kind of a thing, okay? So let's take this one day at a time. Let's take this one thing at a time, and let's just kind of work it through piece by piece. Communicate with me via email if you need something as far as classes are concerned. There's only so much that I can do for you in a distance environment like this. And so we'll just have to make it work. If you need accommodations, we're going to continue to try and provide you with those accommodations even via distance stuff. But it's going to look a little different, and it's going to be a little weird, and we're going to have to figure out how it all works and all the rest of that. So just stay with me piece by piece here. All that to say, let's get to Anselm. Be taking notes, be following me along here. I'm going to try and do this in a relatively condensed version, so the video itself may not be all that long, but it's going to cover some really critical ideas. So idea number 1, remember that Anselm has given us a definition of God. some sort of working definition of God, and that definition is this ontological argument for the existence of God. That is, God is the greatest thing that can be thought. And like just about every philosopher we've ever studied ever, actually I'll take that back. Every philosopher has argued it is better to exist than not exist. What existence looks like, or the best kind of existence, that's what we've debated and we've gone back and forth on. And is Plato's metaphysical the best? Is Baruch Spinoza's goofy God is immanent in all things because he's so transcendent, then all things just subsume their existence up within God kind of a thing? Is this, like, which is the best kind of existence is what we've all argued through. On the other hand, everybody has agreed to exist is always good, and it's always better than not existing. And that's basic, right? It's better to be alive than it is to not be. And I think that fundamental idea is embedded in us from Genesis 1 and 2. It's embedded in human beings because of what we are and where we came from. This idea that it's always better to exist than to not exist is huge. And it is, I think, part of the thing that drives us into this search of truth and of beauty and of God and of all of this. And so all of our philosophers who have touched on this idea that it is better to exist than to not exist are touching on something that's critically important. And I think what they're touching on is this idea, like we've said all year, right? All truth is God's truth. And so if it's true, then it's got roots in what God has said and done, and it's got roots in the scripture, and it's got roots in God's person. And so then we just work that out based on what other people are arguing for us or what they're telling us, and then we're trying to piece that together. So it is always better to exist than not exist because God exists, and he's the ultimate good, St. Anselm, right? And because God has made us in his image and his likeness to be like him, and so it's better for us to exist than to not exist. So that's always step one, okay? Step two on all of this is, hang on. What you need, baby girl? You're hungry for muffins? You would like some breakfast? Okay. Hang on, guys. I'll be right back. I got to get somebody some breakfast. You go sit in your chair, and I'll get you a pack. Don't go anywhere. It's okay. Here's your food. Here you go.
I should sit in my chair.
She did. She sat next to Daddy. All right. Sorry about that. We're back. Let's keep moving here. Okay. So first, God is the greatest thing that can be thought, and it's always greater to exist than not exist. So God, by necessity, then, has to exist in order to be that greatest thing. Hold on. You're welcome, baby girl. All right, I'm back. All right, here we go. So God is the greatest thing that can be thought. And then Anselm uses a series of characteristic of God arguments to back up sort of what he's articulating there. And so it works like this. God is the love by which God loves. God is the justice by which God is just. God is the fill in the blank by which he does that thing. So it works like this. God is the grace by which he is gracious. God is the truth by which he speaks truth. all of these sort of parallels. And so God is the definition of the thing that he manifests in his character, nature, and attributes. And so when we talk about the attributes of God, we're not defining God necessarily. We're talking about how we see God's definition manifested in the world around us. That is, that's a little bit different. And I think it's getting at something biblical. And I think it's getting at something really important. And so God is the wisdom by which God is wise. God defines what wisdom is. And so to know wisdom, we have to know God. And then we see God be wise in his dealings. The fact that we see God being something or doing something, wisdom, truth, beauty, justice, etc., is evidence that that thing exists within God first. And this is a kind of philosophical reality that I think, theological reality, that Anselm, both philosophy and theology, that Anselm's keyed in on. In order for something like me to act in ways that are wise, and for you to be able to describe my dealings, my actions, my whatevers as wise, I must first possess at least some semblance of what this thing, wisdom, is. And so I have to have wisdom in order to be wise. And so if God is the only wise God, that's a quote out of one of the New Testament scriptures. I forget which one off the top of my head, but right, if God is the only wise God, who is blessed forever, amen, then he has to have wisdom. And Anselm takes that one step further. It's not that God just possesses wisdom. It's that because of this supremacy of God, God is the definition of what wisdom is. He actually gives wisdom its existence. Wisdom doesn't exist independent of God, and God has acquired this thing. It's not some hostile takeover from outside. It's this inwardness that's then expressed outwardly. And so God is an inward reality, the definition of wisdom, the definition of truth and beauty and justice, the definition of love, the definition of supremacy. This is God's transcendence. God is beyond us in all of this because God is defining of God's self. He possesses wisdom because he's the essence of wisdom, and therefore he acts with wisdom. And this is sort of what Anselm is arguing is the definition of what it is to be God. And it's what makes God transcendent. It's what makes God beyond us. It's what makes God greater than us. It's what makes God unique in all other things. And so then when we describe God's actions, or we describe God's presence around us in these various ways and places, then what we're getting at is this idea that what we're describing are manifestations of what it is that defines. No, said that the wrong way. See, you fall into it. What we describe in the way God interacts with the world around us is exactly that. It's describing how God interacts because God is the definition of these things we see manifested among us. And it's so easy, like I just did, for us to use the characteristics we see of God as definition of God, as opposed to God as the definition and the characteristics as the manifestation. And that's Anselm. God is the definition, the characteristics are his manifestation. And that, on a thought level, on a paradigm, is very, very much like Platonic understandings of the way that the world works. This metaphysical reality is the definition of how things are, right? The table is the table because that's what it is in the metaphysical. And then the manifestations of that are our tables, like the one my laptop is currently sitting on in my kitchen to conference with you this way. And so Anselm and Plato do this the other way around, right? The table that I experience, the justice and truth that I experience in my life, even if it comes directly from God, those things are not defining of God. They describe him in the way that he deals with the world outside of himself. That makes God, for Anselm, both completely transcendent because of the nature of his existence as definition of all good things, and it makes him immanent because he intends to reveal himself to us in various ways and places. And so God changes the things that we experience and encounter instead of the things changing God. God defines the things that manifest his essence to us instead of those things defining God. We use those as descriptors of how God acts. But God has defined what wisdom is, defined what truth is, defined what beauty is, defined what justice is. God has defined all of those things, and so then he acts with those things as part of his essential character and nature. Okay, so where does that land us? It lands us in this statement from Anselm that God is the essence of the attribute he expresses. That raises a question. Does that mean if God is the essence of the attribute he expresses, does that mean that God is just a sum of his attributes? And Anselm says no, that is to do the argument backwards. It is not that God is the sum of his naturally expressed attributes. It is instead that God is the source of his naturally expressed attributes. And so it would be more proper to say that God is the essence of the attributes because he defines the attributes. Okay? God is the essence of the attribute because he defines the attribute. The difference here is that God isn't possessing the variety of attributes we see. God is generating the variety of attributes that we see in perfection because of his greatness and supremacy. So if we were to talk about God as the sum of his attributes, God would be God because he possesses all of these attributes in a kind of superiority. The only thing that makes God God in that instance is the fact that he's better, stronger, faster. There's not a kind of inherent supremacy, okay? And so then we could work to some point, theoretically, where we possessed the same set of attributes, but better, and then God would not be God any longer. And that is what Anselm is avoiding. And the reason he's avoiding it, I think, comes in large part from the scripture, that the scripture's testimony to God is not that God is some being who's gathered things to himself, conquered them in some sort of way, and now employs them like resources. God is the source of his attributes. He generates these things: truth, beauty, justice, love, perfection, etc. God is the source of all of these things. He originates them, he causes them, and here source language and causality language from Aristotle starts to seep in to Anselm's argument line. But basically what he's arguing is that God is God because God generates all of the things that God is or that God manifests in the world around him. And so God as source means that from God comes all things that actually exist. From God comes all things good. All goodness comes from God. Without God, there is nothing. Not even empty space. And so when we back up in time and space to when God was, and it was just God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and there's no planets, there's no time, there's none of that. There's not even space, it's just God. This reality of time and space, that reality is created by God. And so it's not God existing in space all by himself. Space didn't exist. It's just God. He's the only thing. And then when God creates, he generates all things: space, time, characteristics, attributes we use to talk about God because they're inherent within God. And so this source language is creator language. This is what Anselm is tapping into this one who causes to be. So without God, there's nothing, not even time and space. God is the greatest thing that can be thought, which means he defines all other things that exist, including abstract concepts: truth, beauty, justice, and all the rest of this. So then, how do we get to know God? Because we have to know God to know his attributes, because he defines what those attributes are. And some says, okay, so that's fine. It flows that way from source to us, but we're on the other end of this source spectrum. So it started with God, and he has produced things along the way. and he's demonstrated attributes of who he is along the way. And so it started with God, but now it's over here. And so we are picking up the thread of what God is over here, but we're on this end of the spectrum. And so how do we work back to know God? And here's where Anselm starts to argue. We have to actually take what we see in these attributes of God over here and work backwards to God over here. And so what we do is we study the attributes and the manifestations of God's presence among us in ways that lead us to the perfection of that attribute. Since God is the source of the attribute we're talking about, and he has manifested it amongst us in some way, then to know what it is that God is, we have to back the attribute up to its perfection. So, the problem with that is we need revelation, because our observations of what is over here to get to God over here will only get us so far. And whatever's left is this gap. And in that gap, we need God's revelation to clarify for us exactly how it is the way that it is, right? And so Anselm then argues that through faith, confessed trust and belief in God, theology seeks understanding by employing faith to the gaps where intellectual pursuits leave us with space. So we need rationality, we need conscious thought, we need the ability to analyze and dissect love, truth, justice, beauty, grace, all of these things in order to get us to the point where our understanding ends. And then from that understanding to God is this gap of faith, is this space where faith and revelation and truth given to us by God directly fills in the space. And so God is the source, not only of all of the things that we see and experience, God is the source of the information and the faith that we need that fills in the gap so that we understand who and what God is. And so then Anselm makes a series of singular statement points and explains them. And I'm going to go through the points and just kind of work our way through it. He says, through the rational mind, one comes nearest to knowing the supreme being. We need to employ reason and rationality. It makes sense that if God is the greatest thing that can be thought, and he is defining of his attributes we see manifested in the world around us, then we can use reason to understand that to the best of our ability. It also makes sense that a being like that would be rather rational, especially with the design, organization, and creative genius we see on display in the world around us. So first, we need critical thought. That critical thought starts with this idea that it makes sense. If God, then God has to be the definition of all things. And if that's true, and God is the definition of all things, then we need to know God to know the things that we're talking about. But in order to do that, we got to study what's in front of us first, because we got to get a grip on what is nearest to us, and then we can progress back to God to understand it better and more fully. Okay? So then his second point is this. The mind, the rational, reasonable thought processes of the human mind is the mirror and the image of the supreme being. And so what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Anselm argues that rationality, logical thought, the ability to discern, process, decipher information, and draw rational conclusions is the mark that we have been made in the image of God. However, just because we are rational beings doesn't mean we were made to be rational beings. Anselm argues we were made to love God, and that love is relational and rational and experiential. We seek the good of those we love, okay? And so we seek to do what is in God's best interest, and that is that's rational because it informs itself from God's definitions, and it's relational because we are prioritizing what is in God's best designs when we say we love God. And it's experiential, because then we have to do it in our experiences. And the more we do it and the more we practice it, the better we get at it, the closer we get to understanding what it looks like to love God by doing what is in God's best interest. Next, he says, then the soul that always loves the Supreme Being, that always loves God, lives at some time in true happiness. The effect, the mark of loving God is that human people live happy. And when he talks about happiness, like a lot of the other conversations we've had around happiness, this is not the kind of contemporary understanding we have where happiness is temporary and joy is permanent. It's both put together, because for Anselm, happiness comes from that internal joy, eternal joy, internal joy, that transcendent joy that comes from the character and nature and essence of God. And so for us to be happy, we need to love God. For us to be full of the joy of God, we need to love God. We need to prioritize God. And as we do that, we find this satisfaction for the soul. A lot of what the psalmists talk about and this kind of a thing in the scriptures. Okay. The reason for that. Why do we end up happy? Because the Supreme Being, God, responds to us by giving itself as a reward to the soul that loves God. Covenant, relationship, faithfulness, love, steadfastness, closeness, right? All of this experience of God language from the Psalms. The psalmist asks God to be near, asks him to calm his fears, asks to be comforted, right? Seeks out God's interventions and all these things. And the biblical point to a lot of this is that for those that love God, God comes into relationship with them and gives himself to them in a covenant relationship where the soul is satisfied by the presence of God. And that is exactly then what we're looking at. Now this then marks for Anselm the sort of core purpose of what it is to be human. We are to know God to the best of our ability so that we love God, acting in his best interest and purposes, and so that we are in right relationship with God as God responds by giving himself to us in relationship with us who are seeking him out in truth, beauty, and justice. That is because for Anselm, this is what we were designed to do. And then he notes that happiness is the evidence we are doing what we were created to do with our Creator. On the other hand, the soul that despises the Supreme Being is eternally unhappy. It's the exact opposite. When we do what God has designed us to do, and that is seek, know, prioritize God, accord ourselves with our designer, creator, and understand God as the greatest thing and live in love toward that thing, then we fulfill our purposes and our joy is made manifest, and this thing that is joy from God is communicated to us because God is with us and we are with God, and this relationship suffices all of those things that we need. On the other hand, when we despise him and we reject that relatedness to him, we end up unhappy. It's as simple as that. And then for Anselm, then, the eternal realities of things like heaven and hell are these manifestations of perfect happiness and joy, perfect peace and contentment with God, and then the exact opposite, the perfect lack of peace and contentment, the perfect and absolute lack of joy and peace and satisfaction and all of the rest of this. And so heaven and hell as eternal realities are sort of permanent manifestations of either completeness as we have been designed and made to be, or the perfect manifestation of the total absence of that completeness. And that's where we land with Anselm's understanding. And so here's the deal though. Whatever God is has been communicated to us as those who bear his image. And so if we are not living as we ought, according to the purposes and designs of what God has made humanity to be, then we're going to notice that in ramifications. We're unhappy. We're dissatisfied. We continue to search and look for places, spaces, and things to fill those voids that God has left unfilled, because only He can fill them, but He's only going to fill them when we respond to Him with love and with a seeking to understand who God is and why that understanding matters for shaping our reality. And so it leads us to this place where Augustine's confessions in owning who we are and what we need God to be, and Augustine's confessions in faith sort of form an underpinning to Anselm. God only makes sense if we allow God to define all other things. And that only happens when our rationality runs to its logical end and the space between it and God is filled up by faith in what God reveals to us. And so we need the confession of faith. It is a confession of faith to say that God is the greatest thing that can be thought. And it is a confession of faith to say that because God is the greatest thing that can be thought, God is defining of all things at all times. Like, that's the end of it. But that's all faith. The twist on it for Anselm is that when we engage that faith personally, intentionally, and thoughtfully, and with an intention on loving God, what we find is that we are satisfied. We are overjoyed with the answers that come from knowing God and then knowing the attributes of God as a secondary thing. I don't seek God to know what justice and truth is. I study justice and truth to seek and know who God is. And then as I know God, this confession of faith in me grows. And the byproduct of that is that I find my soul satisfied in these answers that come from who and what God is. This is Anselm's major thrust. Remember, theology is faith seeking understanding. It's a devotional life seeking rational ends that make sense out of who God is, what He does for us, and who we are as His created images and likenesses. Okay? All right. That runs our course with Anselm, and it leaves us here. You're probably going to be seeing this Tuesday, so then there will be another screencast coming your direction in the next couple of days after Tuesday, probably Wednesday or Thursday, okay? And so just stay tuned. This week's a little weird because my plan is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you get screencast material, okay? So right now we don't see that yet. Your confessions project is due Friday the 20th. That's this Friday. Late work policy still applies. The beauty of being able to turn things in digitally. So here's how this is going to work. It's not late until Monday, next Monday. Okay? Monday the 22nd. All right? 23rd? Whatever Monday is. Let me look at a calendar. Next Monday, the 23rd. Correct. Next Monday, the 23rd. Sorry, I got my head screwed on straight now. So it's not late until Monday morning, the 23rd. It's due Friday, which means late work grace extends you to Sunday. Okay. That's the only thing assigned for this week. So be doing that, be working on that. We're going to move in next time we get together via video. We're gonna move into Saint Thomas Aquinas, and instead of being Platonic, he's going to be very Aristotelian. And so those of you that liked Aristotle, he's going to cover that for us. Okay? All right, guys. Love you. Sorry I can't interact with you a little bit more than this, but hopefully this is a way to get good information to you and for us to continue to work forward. So until next time.